So Carrie's presentation explicitly calls out one of our goals for this workshop, which is to begin to clearly and carefully unpack what we mean by the word trust. Trust in what? And what are the components of fostering those elements of trust? So thank you for nailing that one. Before I introduce our next speaker, there was one critical thing I forgot, which is to mention with great appreciation Keegan Sawyer's role in all of the work we do at the Round Table. Keegan's done a fantastic job with this, as she does with everything, so thank you for that, Keegan. And so I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Tim Caulfield, developing the idea of defining trust in science and the factors that affect trust, particularly in a negative way. So I'd like to welcome Tim to the podium. Thank you.
Well, I'd also like to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak today. I love this topic, and I have a really easy, fun job. My job is to warm you up, so I get to speculate a lot and really kind of just touch on key topics. And Carrie's already done a nice job of touching on one of my goals, which is to talk about how complex the idea of trust is. But then I also really do want to talk about all the factors that may impact it. Now, you may wonder what this strange image is. My brother is an art professor, and we've had several projects where we brought together artists, world-renowned artists from all over the world, and scientists to create art based on science. And when I was putting this talk together, I couldn't believe how all of the things that I'm going to talk about now came up again and again with the artists. Just so you know, artists don't trust science. Maybe that's why they're artists. But all of these images that I'm going to show are based largely on that work. So, what is trust? You've already heard a little bit about this, so I can do this very, very quickly. Look, trust is complex, right? And if you look at the literature on point, you hear that again and again. And like David's really nice piece, he says, look, trust, it's complex, and in fact, there's really no consensus on what it is. So one of the things I think that should happen at this event is we should decide on what aspect of trust we're talking about in this context. You do hear a lot of interesting definitions. This one actually from a team at the University of Alberta. They did an interesting survey on this, and they really talk about this idea of trust being a part of vulnerability, the idea that you are allowing other entities, scientists, scientific institutions to sort of lead you in a particular direction. It's a credibility issue. I actually really like this definition, although I don't know about the word truth, that we have from a science blogger. And this individual was talking about trust really being the idea that you believe what people say, that you trust that they're doing things in your best interest, and that all of these factors actually are contingent on who they are and what their motives are. So you find all of these kinds of very interesting definitions, but the bottom line is there's very little consensus out there. And of course, as you just heard, trust in science means very different things to different individuals. And there's been a lot of very cool research on this. This was one done, I believe, from New Zealand not that long ago, where they actually mapped out different populations to get a sense how different populations feel about science. So you have like your confident science believers, they believe everything. You have those that feel like they've been left behind. And all of these different populations see trust differently. For all of these different groups, trust plays out very, very differently. Then, of course, and we'll hear this probably again over and over during this meeting, you have different populations trusting different aspects of science. We just heard that, right? So, the classic thing is that the liberals, don't trust GMOs, and conservatives don't trust the stuff around climate change. I know that's a vast oversimplification, but that's an important part of this story. We're not just talking about one population, we're talking about very different populations. And by the way, an important part of that is whatever we decide as a group of how we should deal with the trust issue will be maybe different for each population, right? How each population will respond to sort of a trust initiative will vary greatly. But I kind of think, and I'm going to cheat here a little bit, because I actually think when we brought this event together, my first reaction was responding to this idea. People don't seem to believe in, or certain populations don't seem to believe in, certain messages coming from the conventional sources of science, from scientists, from research institutions? Why don't people believe in what these scientists or these entities are saying? And I think that's what is meant by this sort of war on science. Now, we can talk about whether this is an appropriate version of trust in science, but I think that this is now the big picture idea when we're talking about trust in science. Why don't people believe what's being said about climate change? Why don't people believe the information on evolution when so many scientists do? And the other aspect of this story, I think, is that people believe crazy things, right? That's another part of this trust in science. Why do people believe crazy things, crazy scientific-ish stuff, right? Why do they believe it? And I love this study, and Carrie, I don't know if you know this one, you probably do, you know every study. So this is a study, it was one of those studies I thought, oh, I wish I did this because it was such a cool idea. What they basically did is they asked a relatively large N of Americans whether they believed in a bunch of really crazy conspiracy theories. And the results were remarkable. Now, whether this is a tremendously robust study or not, I still think the numbers are remarkable. You know, the Food and Drug Administration is deliberately preventing us from getting cancer cures because of drug companies, right? 37% are willing to say they believe that. Then, of course, the big vaccination one. By the way, this 20% number, is pretty consistent in North America. I'm embarrassed to say it's the same number that we have in Alberta. This idea that and that, by the way, Alberta is the most conservative province. It's sort of like Massachusetts, I guess, here. It has here you have like a 20%, they believe this vaccination myth. You have this one here where you have genetically modified foods, myth being believed. But what I think most remarkable from this study is the numbers about the people who are willing to say they disagree, right? Look at those numbers, really, really remarkable. So I think this is a very important part of the trust story. Why? So what's going on? What's happening? So what I decided to do, what are the forces that are kind of eroding this trust, and what has brought us to this alleged war on science? What I decided to do was organize my speculation based on the hate mail that I receive. So I actually write a lot for the popular press, and I receive a lot of hate mail. And a lot of it is on these issues. So I'll write something on gluten-free or on GMOs or organic food, and I'll get some really vicious stuff, right? Really, really vicious comments. And so I thought I would organize because there's so many things that we could talk about. So I thought I'd just pick a few of the topics that I hear frequently in my hate mail. The first one is, so this is organized around that. I hear this all the time. Look, Tim, science is wrong. It's wrong all the time, right? And this is an important theme, right? This idea of bad science. Now, I don't know if you guys saw this very recent editorial in The Lancet by the editor of The Lancet, where they said, look, now whether we agree with this or not, this is the kind of rhetoric that's out there right now. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, is simply untrue. And because of all the forces that are twisting science, science has now taken a turn towards darkness, right? So this is the kind of, science is wrong stuff I hear. And of course, everyone in the room knows a lot of the literature on this. I know there's a lot of big brains here, but there's a lot of interesting research that sort of supports that, right? That supports the problems with the scientific process, that results are greatly exaggerated. They're often, they're very, large effect sizes almost never really happens. This is a great study done by John, where he looked at how the competitive nature of a jurisdiction impacts the effect size, right? So the US has bigger effect size than, say, Belgium. And that's, of course, scientifically impossible, but it really shows how there are all these forces twisting science. And that, of course, has led to a lot of other interesting work. I'm sure many people saw this piece by John, where he made the comment that because of all of the problems with the scientific method and all the forces twisting science, that perhaps 85% of research resources are wasted. Now, again, whether we agree with John's comment or not, and I think he's probably pretty close to the truth, is irrelevant. The important thing for our meeting is that this is out there. And of course, you can layer on top of that all the concern about retractions that have been happening, right? Okay, so then move forward to what the public sees. And again, I'm talking about what I hear all the time from the public. And one thing that I hear again and again in almost every public lecture I do is science can't make up their mind, right? Science is always wrong. How can science be right? How can we trust science? And this happens particularly in the context of health and nutrition. Bacon is the new superfood. It's good for you. Everyone should be having bacon. Turns out bacon is not good for you. Bacon's terrible for you. We all love the idea that wine is good for us, right? And we all want to be able to drink wine. Turns out wine's not so good for you. In fact, antioxidants aren't even good for you. You probably should avoid them. You shouldn't be eating red meat. Turns out red meat is really good for you. You should be eating red meat. Eggs are as bad as smoking, you guys. You shouldn't be eating eggs. Oh, an egg a day keeps the doctor away. You guys have seen these before. Chocolate, this is my favorite one because I love chocolate so much. So I have a cognitive bias to see all of these headlines. Chocolate is good for us. Regular chocolate eaters are in fact thinner because chocolate is calorie neutral. That is like awesome, awesome news, right? That's fantastic news. But it turns out, of course, that that's not true either. So this is really an important message. It seems fun and frivolous, but this is what the public sees. And because of these conflicting stories, trust goes down. There's actually some interesting research to show that. The other interesting thing about that is they stop listening too, right? They stop listening to important health messages. In addition to that, this was a study that we recently published on vitamin D. Vitamin D is like a religion. But here's sort of the opposite thing that the media does. They simplify complex stories, right? So when what we found is the popular press greatly exaggerates the definitiveness of the vitamin D research. So when the public actually hears about the equivocal nature of the science, once again, they start feeling very confused. An area that of personal interest of mine, of course, is celebrity health advice. Again, sounds fun and frivolous, but a really important part of the story, you guys. When you have individuals like this, the king and queen of pseudoscience, to our kingdom, they're toasting. To give it a sense, this is a well-known study. I'm sure many people in the room saw the study. It's from my own university, University of Alberta, where they actually coded all the advice that Dr. Oz got. Have you guys heard of this study? So what they did is they watched numerous episodes of Dr. Oz. Every time Dr. Oz gave a piece of advice, they did a systematic review of that bit of advice. And what was found, 50%, or roughly half of the advice either does not fit the existing literature or conflicts with the existing literature. So when you have that kind of confused messaging around science, it's no surprise that the public is so incredibly confused. And there's lots and lots of research that shows the degree of that confusion. This is one of my favorite ones. There was a similar one done in Canada. But I mean, this is an incredible statement that Americans find doing their taxes simpler than improving their diet and health. When diet and health information is in fact, the evidence-based facts are so incredibly simple. So I think this confusion is a big part of the story. Another big part of the story, and I hear it in my hate mail all the time, is hype, the hype story. And very, very consistent theme. Again, we can talk about whether this really is a factor. I get to speculate here, but I do think it's an important part of the story. This is a paper I wrote with Celeste Condit in 2012, where we tried to map all of the social forces that twist what we hear about science. And we call it the hype pipeline, from career pressure to publication pressure, commercialization pressure, et cetera. They're all complicit collaborators, all those forces. And of course, the public is at the end here, right? This is what the public hears. They're at the end of the pipeline after all of these forces have twisted what the science really says. And again, lots and lots of data I could pull on for each one of those points there. But this is a study I thought I'd draw on because, again, it got a lot of hype itself. And this was the degree to which institutions hype stories, health stories that flow from their institution. That press releases greatly exaggerate what's said. And again, the public hears that kind of stuff. And I actually have had this study quoted to me in my hate mail. saying, why should we trust you? Everything's exaggerated. One of the interesting things that's often forgotten in this study is they found that there was little evidence that exaggeration in press releases actually had an impact on the uptake of the news, which is kind of interesting, right? It's a good news story. You don't have to hype it in order to get it in the popular press. So you have this hype, this exaggeration that's going on. You see it everywhere, these intense promises, particularly in the context of big science. We've done a lot of work in the area of stem cells, mapping the hype in stem cells, you have headlines like stem cells can treat diabetes, the miracle stem cell cure made in Britain, on and on, Peyton Manning and his miracle cure. You have all of those kinds of headlines. We just published a piece in Science Translational Medicine, came out just a few weeks ago actually, where we try to get a sense of timelines, right? And in other words, how are our stem cell studies being portrayed in the context of when they're going to be in the clinic? And what we found was that almost 70%, and these are the elite newspapers, predicted that the stem cell therapy would be in the clinic in 5 to 10 years or sooner, which is really remarkable. That's really clearly not going to happen probably, but that 70% of the articles. So you have that kind of hype happening all of the time, and as a result of that, you have this kind of backlash happening, right? You have this kind of, we can't trust what science says because it's all exaggerated and hyped and twisted anyway. Okay, so the other important factor here, and one I think that's underplayed and we don't hear that much about, is that we've been told, as in the developed nations, we've been told not to trust science. So what do I mean by that? I mean, so this postmodern trend, right? All knowledge is relative. Now, I started my academic career in the 90s. I don't know if there's academics in here that also started in the 90s. And this was a really big theme. And I think it's an important part of the story. And again, turning back to my hate mail, I hear it all the time. Right? I hear Thomas Kuhn and Foucault brought up all the time, usually incorrectly, but they're brought up all the time, and this kind of statement, right? I realize that evidence doesn't support homeopathy, but as Thomas Kuhn said, and we hear that again and again. We were told, the whole postmodern idea is that we should be suspicious of science as an institution, that scientific knowledge is socially constructed, et cetera. And that, I think, does create, and again, I'm speculating here, I think it does create room for people like Jenny McCarthy. Why not listen to Jenny McCarthy? I don't know if anyone saw that show. It was her and an individual from the CDC, a PhD from the CDC. All knowledge is relative, so Jenny McCarthy. And you see that kind of false balance happen all the time, right? And I do think that this has made room for it, right? This idea that we should give weight to all voices, right? Thank you, Stephen Hawking, and now for a different perspective on the movement of the stars. I really do think that this is a remnant of this postmodern kind of thinking. Layer on top of that, another phenomenon that happens that I think is directly related to this is quackademics. So again, I hear this all the time in my hate mail. What do I mean by that? You probably wonder where I was going with the ducks. That's where I was going with the ducks, quackademics. When you have research institutions, and I picked on Canadian ones, but I could have done it with American ones, who are doing research on very questionable scientific activities, whether you're talking about, these are ones that clearly have zero scientific legitimacy, right? Reiki, homeopathy, Ralphing, all these kind of energy things. This is scientifically bunk, right? So when universities are doing that, you hear the public say, well, what are we supposed to believe? If universities are doing this research, why not believe it, right? Why not believe it? Here's a good example of MacEwan University in Canada, where they talk about, you can get an acupuncture degree, where they talk about the body's energy flow and the disease is caused by an imbalance of energy. This sends a very confusing message to the public, right? So why not believe nonsense when you hear this kind of stuff all the time? Why should you trust science? What is science? This is a very confused message. So the next factor, and I think perhaps one of the most important trends today, is the commercialization of science, right? You see this has become a huge force, and we just finished a big study where we mapped all of the forces commercializing science. And it's starting from international institutions right down to universities, and it is an incredibly consistent theme. In fact, we argue there's no space to get research funding right now, at least in the health sciences, that is not touched by this commercialization ethos. In fact, it's been, Barack Obama has brought it up, I think, in his last 2 State of the Union addresses. So this is a tremendous force, and at least in my country, in Canada, a huge shift. Everyone here knows how this can have an impact, commercialization, on research results. There's a vast body of literature how it will bias research results if you have close ties to industry. But more importantly for our discussion, there is also a big body of research on how it directly impacts public trust in the results, and public trust in the individuals doing the research. This was a study that we did in Canada in the context of biobanking, but there's lots of other studies. You can see how even university research, so we have university researchers funded by industry, university researchers funded by government, and you can see the erosion in trust. It's actually quite remarkable. And this builds on a lot of other research that found the same thing. Christine Critchley's done some really cool work on this in Australia, and again, the research is very, very consistent. You involve commercial entities, even if you are a public-funded researcher, and trust is eroded. The other important one that I think is underplayed, and again, it sounds fun and frivolous, but I think it's a very important factor when you're talking about the general public, is pop culture. When you have people like Katy Perry making silly comments about vitamin supplements, she allegedly takes 26 a day. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's the story. She tweets about it. I say, who cares? How many followers does Katy Perry have? Couple million? Try 69, almost 70 million followers, right? So how many does the National Academy of Science have? I think it's not, do you have 1,000? I'm not sure. It's more than this guy, and it's more than this guy, and he's got stuff to tweet about, right? So this, and there's fascinating research that shows that this has an impact, that these kinds of tweets have an impact, that people develop a parasocial, I follow Katie, develop a parasocial relationship, they feel like you're tweeting directly to you. Why is it relevant for our discussion? Well, as Cass Sunstein and others have noted, there is this phenomenon of the availability bias. So even if you don't believe Jenny McCarthy, even if you don't believe Katy Perry, they put this stuff about science out there, right? And it sort of feeds the availability cascade, reinforcing the beliefs that may be less than scientifically accurate. And I'll give you one really quick example. Here's a study on many people in the room I'm sure are aware of it, that on autism and vaccination, and it was a study that was subsequently debunked, came out not that long ago. So you have the study come out. It gets reported in sort of quasi-legitimate news sources. It gets picked up by autism activists, and then it starts to get debunked. And of course, the debunking doesn't get picked up quite as much. And you have the availability cascade take over, right? So here are all the tweets that are about that story. And I looked at them earlier today, and there's even more of them, right? So you have pop culture playing an incredibly important role here. They create these echo chambers that allow misinformation to thrive. And it really, I think, starts to erode public trust. Now, the other one, and I think it's often underplayed, that I also hear in my hate mail, is what I call trust wars. And what that is individuals leveraging all the things that we're talking about at this meeting, right, and emphasizing it to help create an antitrust narrative. So what do I mean by that? So I'm sure everyone here has been following Dr. Oz's problems over the last little while. He, in his letter, he said, we're not going anywhere. And in his response to the allegations against him, he used virtually all of the things that I heard in my hate mail and all of the things that we're going to talk to about at this meeting. He used conflict of interest and the commercialization of science to say, this is why you shouldn't believe those people and you should believe me. He used the idea that, we don't really know what science says. Science isn't right. He uses the whole postmodern narrative, right, that science is, knowledge is relative. And he basically creates this antitrust narrative to help keep it alive. And a lot of other people do it. I shouldn't pick on just Dr. Oz, but he was so available. But a really good example how this trust narrative is created. So there are, of course, a lot of challenges, and I won't go through all of them. I just want to highlight how incredibly, obviously, and again, people probably know this study very, very well. This is a study that shows that, just providing people with scientific information isn't going to do the trick. It really is challenging. This was a study that showed that providing people who had an anti-vaccination belief system, we provide scientific information, they don't change their mind. In fact, they become more wedded to their beliefs. So what's next? There's been a lot of discussion about how to deal with this, of course. We need to deal with the commercialization of science issue. Some people hope that more openness in science is going to have an impact, dealing with conflict of interest. Having more reproducible research. All of those things are going to help. Other people have talked about the idea that we need to educate not just about science, but the scientific method, and there's some interesting data to support that idea. But I'm a big believer, and I like to end my talks with this one. I genuinely believe that producing and protecting good, independent science is one of the most important functions of the government and a liberal democracy. And I think that's a very important message for this group. I think it's a very important message for all governments. And I think that this idea of independence is core, is absolutely core to the issue of trust that we're going to talk about today. So I'll end saying thank you to my wonderful team and all of the entities that I twist and hype my research for. So thanks very, very much. So time for a few quick questions. You feel warmed up a little bit?
Hi. To what extent do you think the lack of scientific literacy among a population lends to the ability to not be able to sort through all of this information or misinformation, or the ability to be influenced by quasi-science or quack science? So
Carrie can probably speak to this also. There's fascinating research on this that kind of points in both directions. So I actually took out some slides for timing purposes, and there's one study that showed that, and again, it wasn't a huge study, but still I think the result is interesting, so I'm going to refer to it, where they found that people with a university education were actually more likely to believe pseudoscientific information than people with and not trust scientists than people with a high school education. Now there's other research that points in the other direction, but I think it just shows the complexity of the issue. Just educating people isn't necessarily going to do that. There is some fascinating research, again, it's small stuff, it's been done in the context of complementary alternative medicine to show that explaining the scientific method as opposed, there is this idea that science is a list of facts, right? And if you disprove one of those facts, the house of cards falls. As opposed to educating people the nature. So there's some evidence to suggest that that helps and goes to that scientific literacy issue. And the other one, of course, is teaching, and this is happening in Canada more and more, teaching critical thinking to kids and critical media analysis. So I think there's some evidence that that helps also. But I think it's a toolkit that we have to, expand. Yes?
I just wanted to say one thing about the Jenny McCarthy appearance on Oprah. I don't actually think, from what I remember about that they had anyone from the CDC.
So that was CNN.
Oh, CNN.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right. What I remember, I just want to say, because I'm in the media, I'm at USA Today. I mean, I think what was really telling about her appearance on Oprah was that they had a quote from the CDC. Oprah didn't actually have anyone from the CDC, which is a terrible problem for Oprah and the media, but also a real fault with the CDC, that the CDC, as a government agency, as a scientific agency, didn't feel the need and didn't trust their own people enough to go on TV and defend vaccines. And if Oprah refused to give them that chance, then that's a problem. But I'm guessing it's because the CDC didn't want to go on that show, and that's a real problem.
I agree with you, and if I could comment on that really quickly. One of my beliefs is that we need to be brave, and we need to speak out, and the scientific community needs to become engaged and become part of this story. Popular culture is not going away, celebrities aren't going away, and we need to become part of the discussion. Otherwise, that narrative isn't there. So I agree with you. Thank you. So I'll end. Thanks very much.